My brother announced he was keeping my dog because 2 weeks of feeding him made him the real owner. When my brother opened his front door holding my service dog's leash like it belonged to him, I actually reached out to take it before I understood he wasn't handing it over. Grant stepped back instead, angling his body to block the doorway the same way you'd guard a threshold you'd already decided to defend, and told me, calmly, that Juno had settled into a routine at his place, and it would be selfish of me to disrupt that, just because I'd gotten out of the hospital. I stood on his porch 14 days after emergency surgery, still moving like something held together with tape, staring at my own dog sitting obediently at my brother's feet, and I laughed the way people laugh right before they realize nothing about this is funny at all. I'd had Juno for 3 years by that point, a golden retriever trained specifically as a psychiatric service dog. After a home invasion left me with panic attacks so severe, I sometimes couldn't leave my own bedroom without her pressed against my leg, reminding my nervous system I was safe. My name is Odessa Kingsley, 33, an art teacher at a public high school, and Juno wasn't a pet in the ordinary sense so much as a piece of medical equipment that happened to breathe and love me back. I trusted my brother completely when my appendix ruptured without warning, and I ended up in emergency surgery, followed by 2 weeks of hospitalization for a resulting infection. Because who else would I trust with the one thing keeping my nervous system tethered to the ground? Grant was 36, a mechanic with his own shop 2 towns over, engaged to a woman named Marnie Ashford, and for most of our adult lives he'd been the brother who showed up, the one who fixed my car for free and helped me move apartments twice without complaint. I called him from the emergency room myself, voice shaking, and he arrived within the hour to take Juno home with him, promising it would only be a couple of weeks. Easy, no problem, go focus on getting better. I remember feeling relieved in a way that now embarrasses me, grateful that the hardest part of a medical crisis had one less variable attached to it. The early red flag, the one I explained away from a hospital bed with an IV in my arm, came 4 days in, when Grant texted me a photo of Juno at what he called her new favorite spot on his living room couch, the caption reading, "She's adjusting so well, almost like she's always lived here." I told myself it was a harmless, slightly clumsy attempt at reassurance, the kind of thing people say when they're trying to comfort a sick sister, rather than something worth reading into. I didn't know yet that Grant had lost his own childhood dog, a mutt named Scout, when our parents' divorce forced a fast move into an apartment that didn't allow pets, and that Scout had gone to a shelter 24 years earlier without Grant ever getting a real goodbye, a wound our family had always treated as ancient history rather than something still quietly bleeding. I rationalized the second red flag too, a week into my hospital stay, when I noticed on Instagram that Grant had posted a video of Juno running through his backyard with the caption, "My girl finally gets some real space to run," a caption that used the word "my" in a way that made something in my chest tighten even through the haze of pain medication. I told myself he was just proud of taking good care of her, that possessive language slips out of people who are tired and overextended, that reading anything sinister into a dog video said more about my own anxiety disorder flaring under stress than anything actually happening at his house. The cold, quiet part of me that noticed these details anyway got harder to ignore with every photo he sent. The third red flag arrived 9 days into my recovery, when I called to check on Juno and Marnie answered Grant's phone instead, telling me, a little too brightly, that they'd taken Juno in for a wellness check with a new vet closer to their side of town, just to be thorough. I asked why they hadn't used my regular vet, whose records already had 3 years of Juno's history, and Marnie's answer came a beat too slow, something about convenience and scheduling that didn't fully make sense given that both clinics were roughly the same distance from Grant's shop. My hands were shaking by the end of that call, not from the surgery this time, but from a feeling I couldn't yet name, a sense that pieces of my life were quietly being relocated without my permission while I lay flat on my back unable to stop it. I was discharged 11 days after my surgery, still moving slowly, still on antibiotics for the infection that had extended my hospital stay well past the routine 48 hours doctors had originally predicted. I called Grant that same afternoon to arrange picking up Juno, and he told me he was slammed at the shop, and could I wait until the weekend, that Juno had a grooming appointment already scheduled he didn't want to cancel. I told myself he was just being practical, juggling his own responsibilities on top of a favor he hadn't asked for, and I waited, each day adding another small brick to a wall I still refused to name as a wall. By the time I finally showed up at his door on that 14th day, weak enough that Marnie had to help me up the porch steps, I'd stopped believing my own excuses somewhere around the 4th day of waiting. Grant stood in the doorway with Juno beside him wearing a new collar I didn't recognize, sky blue instead of the worn green one I'd bought her 3 years earlier, and something about that small, deliberate substitution told me everything before he said a single word. "She's settled in," he said, the same phrase Marnie had used days earlier, like they'd rehearsed it together. "I don't think it's fair to her to keep moving her around right when she's finally found stability." I told him Juno was my service dog, that I needed her for medical reasons he understood perfectly well, and Grant's expression didn't waver at all, like he'd already prepared for exactly this argument. I fed her every single day for 2 weeks, he said. I walked her, I paid for her grooming, I took her to the vet when she had that ear infection you didn't even know about. I've put in real work here, Odessa, and work like that means something. I think, honestly, I'm her real owner at this point, and I'm not going to just hand her back because you're feeling guilty about needing help. My knees went weak in a way that had nothing to do with my recovering incision, and I stood on that porch understanding, for the first time, that my brother genuinely believed what he was saying. I asked him what he meant by real owner, my voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady, and Grant reached inside the door and pulled out a manila folder that had clearly been sitting ready, prepared in advance for exactly this confrontation. I've documented everything, he said. Vet visits under my name, the grooming receipts, even updated her microchip registration to my contact information in case she ever got lost while she was in my care. Any reasonable person looking at this would say I've been her actual caretaker this whole time, not you, lying in a hospital bed unable to do any of it yourself. I felt something cold slide down my spine, because updating a microchip registration isn't a passive act of convenience. It's a deliberate legal claim, the kind you make when you already intend to keep something. I told him I was calling the police, and Grant's face shifted for just a second, something flickering behind his composed expression before he smoothed it back over. Go ahead, he said. It's a dog dispute. They're not going to do much of anything, and once they see how well I've cared for her, they'll probably side with me anyway. I made the call from his porch with my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone twice, watching Juno through the open door, tail wagging, oblivious to the fact that two people who loved her were about to spend months fighting over which one of us she legally belonged to. The officer who arrived was a woman named Officer Dax Milborn, and her expression made clear she'd expected a minor neighbor dispute, not a full custody standoff over a service animal. When I explained that Juno was a medically necessary psychiatric service dog, and that my brother was refusing to return her after a temporary 2-week arrangement, her posture changed, sharpening into something more focused. Sir, she said to Grant, am I understanding correctly that you're refusing to return a service animal to a person with a documented medical need for it? Grant handed her the folder without hesitation, clearly confident it would settle things in his favor. Officer Milborn flipped through the pages slowly, her expression unreadable, until she reached a document near the back that made her pause. This says here you have a signed surrender form, she said, holding it up. Dated the day after her surgery, transferring ownership to you. I stared at the page over the officer's shoulder, my name typed at the bottom beside a signature that was supposed to be mine. Dated to a day I now know for a fact I was still under general anesthesia in a recovery room, unable to sign anything at all. Grant had forged my signature on a surrender form and dated it to a day I couldn't possibly have written it. The exact same architecture of lie. I would later learn plenty of people build when they've convinced themselves that taking something counts as earning it. Officer Milborn asked where the document had been notarized, and Grant answered readily, naming a small notary office 2 towns over run by a man he knew from the shop named Gideon Halbrook, someone who'd apparently done it quickly as a personal favor. She radioed the information in, and within a few minutes, dispatch confirmed something that made Grant's confident expression falter for the first time since I'd arrived. Gideon Halbrook's notary commission had been suspended 8 months earlier following a state investigation into a string of improperly witnessed signatures, an investigation that, according to dispatch, was still actively open. Grant's face went from certainty to something closer to panic in the span of a few seconds, though he tried, unsuccessfully, to keep talking his way past it. Officer Milborn photographed the folder page by page, documenting every item with a narration into her body camera, and told Grant plainly that a forged signature on a fraudulent surrender document was not a civil disagreement between siblings, it was potential evidence in a criminal matter. She explained she couldn't physically force the return of the dog on the spot without a court order establishing legal ownership, since property disputes, even ones involving a beloved animal, generally required documentation resolved through the appropriate channels. But she made it very clear in her report that Grant's story had holes large enough to drive a truck through. I left that porch without Juno that day, and it remains one of the worst moments of my adult life, watching my dog sit calmly beside the man who'd just tried to steal her while I stood there physically too weak to do anything about it myself. I called Dr. Idris Chalfant, Juno's veterinarian of 3 years, the moment I got home, my voice shaking so hard the receptionist had to ask me to repeat myself twice. Dr. Chalfant pulled Juno's full chart while I waited on hold, confirming that her original microchip registration, filed the week I first adopted her, listed me as the sole registered owner, a record with a timestamp that predated anything Grant could have filed by 3 full years. He told me he'd be glad to provide a written statement and formal records for any legal proceeding, adding, with a kind of quiet outrage in his voice, that he'd trained under a mentor who used to say a stolen pet case was one of the ugliest kinds of theft, because the victim on the other end never got a say in who they belonged to. I hired an attorney named Selwyn Danvers the next morning, a lawyer who specialized in animal property disputes, a legal category I hadn't even known existed until a search engine handed me his name at 11 at night while I sat awake replaying my brother's face on that porch. Selwyn listened to my entire account without interrupting, occasionally circling a date or underlining a phrase, and when I finished, he told me the forged surrender document was, paradoxically, the best thing that could have happened to my case, because it converted the dispute from an ambiguous emotional disagreement about caregiving into a documented crime with a paper trail. Selwyn explained that under state law, dogs are generally treated as personal property, meaning ownership typically comes down to provable purchase, adoption records, and consistent documented care history, rather than who happened to be feeding an animal during a short window of time. He filed an emergency motion for what's called a writ of replevin, a legal mechanism specifically designed to recover wrongfully held personal property quickly, attaching Dr. Chalfont's 3 years of veterinary records, my original adoption paperwork from the Service Dog Training Organization, and Officer Milbourne's incident report documenting the forged surrender form as supporting evidence. Selwyn brought in a digital forensics examiner named Soraya Lindquist to analyze Grant's phone records, once the criminal side of the case gave investigators cause to subpoena them, and what came back reframed everything I thought I understood about my brother's intentions. Soraya's report showed Grant had search terms including how to legally become the owner of an adopted pet, and abandonment laws for pets left in temporary care, nearly 5 days before my surgery had even been scheduled, meaning he'd been researching this exact scenario before there was any medical emergency at all, before Juno had spent a single night under his roof. I sat with that report for a long time, understanding that my brother hadn't stumbled into a moment of misplaced attachment the way grief sometimes ambushes people. He'd been planning something, quietly, in the weeks before my appendix ever ruptured, waiting for an opportunity that finally arrived dressed as a medical emergency. Selwyn told me gently that this kind of premeditation, documented in a person's own search history, made it almost impossible for a defense attorney to later argue the theft had been an impulsive act of misguided love, rather than a calculated plan. Around that same time, our mother called me in tears, having heard a version of events from Grant that painted me as the villain, a sister who'd abandoned her dog during a medical crisis and was now trying to punish her brother for stepping up. I told her the truth, about the forged signature, the suspended notary, the search history predating my surgery, and she went quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying something that finally connected pieces of this puzzle I hadn't put together myself. She reminded me, gently, that Grant had never fully recovered from losing Scout during the divorce, that he'd cried himself sick the week that dog went to the shelter, and that some part of him, all these years later, might have finally seen a chance to fix something that had never actually been broken by anyone but circumstance. Understanding Grant's grief didn't soften what he'd done, but it did explain, in a way that made my chest ache with something more complicated than pure anger, why a man who'd never shown a single dishonest bone in his adult life had apparently spent days building a fraudulent paper trail. Selwyn told me that motive, however sympathetic, doesn't change legal ownership, and that the court's job wasn't to weigh whose grief mattered more, but to determine, factually, whose name belonged on the paperwork that actually counted. The crisis peaked 9 days after the porch confrontation, when Marnie called me in a panic, her voice low like she was hiding in another room, telling me Grant had booked a moving truck and was planning to relocate to a job opportunity 2 states away within 48 hours, taking Juno with him before any court hearing could resolve the ownership question. My hands went cold around the phone, my mind spinning through every worst-case outcome, because once Juno crossed a state line, the entire legal process would become exponentially harder to untangle. Jurisdiction and enforcement suddenly split across 2 different court systems that didn't automatically talk to each other. I called Selwyn immediately, and he moved faster than I'd ever seen a lawyer move, filing an emergency temporary restraining order that same afternoon specifically barring Grant from removing Juno from the state pending the outcome of the replevin action. The judge signed it within hours, citing the forged surrender document and Grant's own search history as sufficient grounds to treat the situation as a genuine flight risk regarding disputed property, language that felt almost absurdly clinical, applied to a dog who spent her days curled up asleep at somebody's feet, unaware her entire fate hinged on court filings she'd never understand. Officer Milbourne and a second deputy delivered the restraining order to Grant's house that evening, and according to the report filed afterward, he answered the door already halfway through loading boxes into a rental truck parked in his driveway, Juno visible through the front window, pacing near the door in the particular anxious loop she does when she senses chaos building around her. Grant read the order twice, his composure finally breaking all the way through, and told the officers this was insane, that he'd done nothing but care for a dog nobody else had bothered to take care of properly. A sentence Officer Milbourne noted in her report as revealing, in its own way, more than Grant probably intended it to. The replevin hearing was scheduled 6 days later, moved to the front of the docket because of the flight risk finding, and I sat in a small courtroom that felt absurdly formal for a dispute technically categorized as property recovery. Watching my brother arrive in a blazer that didn't fit him quite right, Marnie beside him with an expression I couldn't fully read. Selwyn laid out the case methodically, starting with Dr. Chalfont's 3 years of veterinary records, establishing continuous ownership, moving to the original adoption paperwork from the service dog training organization, then to the forged surrender document with its impossible signature date, and finally to Soraya's forensic report showing search activity that predated my surgery entirely. Grant's attorney argued that 2 weeks of full-time, hands-on care constituted meaningful evidence of a caretaking bond, that dogs form attachments to whoever feeds and walks them consistently, and that severing Juno from Grant now, after everything he'd invested, would cause her genuine emotional distress. Selwyn's response came sharp and immediate, pointing out that Juno was a professionally trained psychiatric service animal, whose entire purpose depended on a specific, established bond with her handler. A bond documented not by 2 weeks of borrowed affection, but by 3 years of training records, medical necessity letters, and a disability accommodation filed with my employer specifically naming Juno as my registered service animal. Wanda Pruitt, a certified professional dog trainer who had originally trained Juno for service work and still consulted on her ongoing certification, testified that removing a psychiatric service dog from her established handler risked undoing years of specialized conditioning, explaining in careful, professional language that service dogs aren't simply pets who happen to be well-behaved. They're working animals whose training is calibrated specifically to one person's nervous system and specific panic responses. She told the court that reassigning Juno to a new owner after just 2 weeks wouldn't just be legally questionable, it would be functionally destructive to the very purpose Juno had been trained for in the first place. The judge reviewed every document slowly, asking pointed questions about the notary's suspended commission and the timing of Grant's search history relative to my surgery date. Questions Grant's attorney struggled to answer, without eventually conceding that the surrender document could not be authenticated as legitimate. When the judge finally ruled, he ordered immediate return of Juno to my custody, granted the writ of replevin in full, and referred the forged document directly to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges, noting on the record that a service animal's medical necessity for its handler outweighed any caregiving claim built on a fraudulent foundation. A sheriff's deputy accompanied Selwyn and me to Grant's house that same afternoon to enforce the court order, and I still remember the exact sound Juno made when she saw me step out of the car, a full-body shudder of recognition followed by a sound somewhere between a whine and a bark that I felt in my own chest before I even reached the porch. She hit me at a full run, nearly knocking me backward despite my still healing incision, and I sank down onto Grant's front lawn and let her climb half into my lap, burying my face in her fur while my brother stood in his own doorway watching his sister recover something he'd spent 2 weeks convincing himself was his to keep. The criminal case moved forward over the following months, and the district attorney's office, after reviewing Soraya's forensic report and Officer Milbourne's original incident documentation, charged Grant with forgery and attempted theft of service animal, a charge that carried enhanced penalties in our state specifically because of Juno's status as a medically necessary disability accommodation, rather than an ordinary pet. Gideon Halbrook, the notary who'd fraudulently stamped the surrender document, was charged separately as part of the broader investigation already underway against him, his commission permanently revoked and his own case folded into a growing pattern the state had been building for nearly a year before Grant ever walked into his office. Grant's attorney initially pushed for a plea deal, and the prosecutor, a methodical woman named Assistant District Attorney Priyansh Okonkwo, no relation to anyone else already tangled in this mess, offered probation with mandatory restitution covering my legal fees and a permanent record reflecting the forgery conviction. Grant rejected it at first, according to Selwyn, still apparently convinced that a jury would see 2 weeks of devoted caregiving and side with him over a sister who'd abandoned her dog during a hospital stay. The same script he'd been running since the moment he opened his front door holding a leash that wasn't his. The trial never actually happened, because 3 weeks before it was scheduled to begin, Marnie left him, moving out of the house they shared and providing, according to Selwyn, a voluntary statement to the prosecutor describing conversations she'd overheard in the days before my surgery, including one where Grant told her plainly that, if Odessa's out of commission long enough, maybe I finally get to keep something that should have been mine a long time ago. A sentence that made even his own defense attorney recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that he take whatever deal remained on the table before a jury heard it read aloud. Grant accepted a plea 2 weeks later, pleading guilty to forgery and attempted theft, sentenced to 18 months probation, 200 hours of community service, and a restitution order covering my full legal fees, just over $11,000 by the time everything was tallied. The judge, reading the sentence aloud, noted for the record that using a disabled sister's medical vulnerability as an opportunity to manufacture false ownership documents represented, in her words, a particular kind of cruelty dressed up as devotion. Language I still think about whenever I catch myself wondering if I judged my brother too harshly. I didn't speak to Grant again for almost a year after the sentencing. Not out of spite so much as genuine inability to reconcile the brother who'd fixed my car for free with the man who'd forged my signature while I was unconscious on an operating table. Our mother kept a careful, painful neutrality between us during that stretch, relaying occasional updates I didn't ask for, that Grant had started therapy as part of his probation requirements, that he'd finally talked, for the first time in 24 years, about the exact moment Scout was surrendered to that shelter, and how he'd never once been allowed to say goodbye. Juno's recovery took longer than I expected. 3 weeks of unsettled sleep and a startle response more sensitive than it had been before her 2 weeks away. Small setbacks Wanda Pruitt helped me work through with a series of retraining sessions, designed to reestablish the specific behavioral cues our bond depended on. Watching my own service dog relearn how to trust that I'd stay put made the entire ordeal feel smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because it was, in the end, just a dog dispute the way Grant had dismissively called it on his porch, and larger because that dog was the only reason I could leave my house most days without my chest closing in on me. 14 months after the sentencing, Grant reached out through our mother, asking if I'd be willing to meet him somewhere neutral. No expectations, just a conversation he said he owed me regardless of whether I ever forgave him. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what a year of court-mandated therapy had actually done to the version of my brother who'd stood in that doorway certain he deserved my dog more than I did. We met at a diner near his old shop, and he looked smaller somehow. The confidence that had once felt so natural on him replaced by something more careful, more aware of the space he was taking up. He told me he understood now, in a way therapy had apparently forced him to sit with rather than avoid, that losing Scout as a kid had never actually healed, that some part of him had spent 24 years waiting for a chance to undo a loss that was never mine to fix in the first place. He said watching me recover in that hospital bed had triggered something ugly and possessive he hadn't recognized in himself, until it was already built into a folder of forged documents sitting ready by his front door. I told him understanding where the impulse came from didn't erase what it had cost me. 3 months of legal fees and a service dog who still occasionally startled at the sound of a door closing too fast, and he nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer and had no argument left to offer against it.